When action fans speak of Chanbara or samurai films, most people think primarily of the work of Akira Kurosawa, of Kihashi Okamoto and his marvelous Sword of Doom, of the cult and influential Lone Wolf and Cub saga, or of more recent fare like Takashi Miike's 13 Assassins, or the internationally acclaimed Rurouni Kenshin pentalogy. However, the genre goes back much further than Kurosawa's masterpieces, and the vast majority of early jidaigeki from the 1920s and 1930s are still underseen, under-discussed, and hard to find, despite being some of the most innovative, seminal, and influential works in the history of action cinema. Some of them are irremediably lost, victims of time and the ravages of war, while others remain locked up in film archives, largely unseen since their initial release. Thankfully, some do survive, and have found their way to cinephile circles. This video endeavors to give an overview of the early decades of the jidaigeki and highlight these films' incredible modernity and creativity. The genre has a dual lineage. Nationally, its structure, subject matter, and iconography are derived from kabuki theater. The dance-like and stylized performances, the elaborate makeup, the costumes that define this art form can all be found in early samurai films. Shibata Tsunekishi's Momejigari, filmed in 1899, is the oldest extant Japanese film and stands as an important transitional step between onstage theater and cinema. A filmed performance of famous kabuki actors not initially meant for public screening, it works both as a work of fiction and as a documentary proof of what kabuki theater was like at the time. We must jump more than 20 years ahead to find the next avatar of Japanese period action cinema. Jiraiya the Hero, from Shozo Makino, released in 1921, enters pre-tokusatsu territory through the inclusion of a supernatural creature, namely a giant frog. The film is the oldest surviving adaptation of an old folk tale, named The Tale of the Gallant Jiraiya, which will be adapted many more times in later years. The style of the film is still heavily influenced by its theater roots. The still camera gives the feeling we are watching something happening on a stage, while the actors perform elaborate movements, filling the scene with energy. Early Japanese cinema's close relationship with theater proved to be a double-edged sword. On the bright side, it attracted a similar audience, meaning that the medium was not looked down upon as much as might have been the case in other countries. On the other hand, it took Japanese film directors a bit longer to start exploring other possibilities of filmmaking. Just a year later, Japan ramps up the special effects work in Shibukawa Bangoro, directed by Kokishi Tsukiyama in 1922. The use of tricks and stop-motion animation expand the possibilities of the medium, while the fixed camera remains a staple of the country's output in the early 1920s. Here, action is a dance. It's graceful, but unrealistic. In addition, the film also features various types of action, from sword fighting to sumo tournaments to hand-to-hand combat. As the mid-20s approach, things start to change. Quite the leap is made in terms of variety of setups in Kosuzume Toge from Koruko Numata in 1923. The action evolves through various locations, building a narrative flow that completely deviates from kabuki narration. The fighters' movements become less aesthetically sophisticated and more naturalistic. Backward Flow from Buntaro Futagawa in 1924 continues in the previous film's more naturalistic vein and introduces the idea of alternating long and medium shots during the fight, adding dynamism and context to the scene. These innovations were inspired by American films, which were quite popular in 1920s Japan. In addition, some Japanese filmmakers went to the United States in the 1910s and worked there in various capacities, before going back to Japan. Such was the case of Kisaburo Kurihara, who worked there as an actor for a few years, starring in Reginald Barker's The Wrath of the Gods in 1914, before going back to his home country with the idea of modernizing Japanese cinema by incorporating analytic editing, cross-cutting, matches on action, and eyeline matches in his own film Narekin, or Sanji Goto, The Story of Japanese Inner Garden, in 1920. Building from these evolutions, speed accelerates in the climax for Orochi, directed by Buntaro Futagawa in 1925. The film reaches hitherto unseen level of dynamism by exploiting the one versus many trope and by undercranking the action. Camera movement starts getting noticeable and efficient. Here, with the high-angle backward tracking shot, the presence of the Banshee narrator really adds to the experience. And Orochi stands as a great example of triple narration through images, music, and voiceover, which was a staple of early Japanese cinema. The genre comes into its own with Chokon in 1926, from Daisuke Ito, a director of prime importance in its evolution. His work will expand the genre's possibilities over several decades. Chokon has only one surviving reel, dedicated to the climatic fight that used to end the movie. It brings together all of the innovations up to this point: change of setups, varying field sizes, naturalistic fighting, and adds a more mobile, handheld camera and a sense of rhythm to the editing, on top, of course, of more and more elaborate choreographies. Chokon remains one of the most impressive and ahead of its time examples of a style of filmmaking named the calligraphic style. David Bordwell described it as a flamboyant, frantic style, bristling with energetic figure movement, often conveyed in fast motion, rapid and discontinuous editing, tight telephoto framings, and above all, bravura camera movements, whip pans, fast dollies, bumpy handheld shots. It's a style in which everything is sacrificed to the expression of dynamic physical action, and the style reaches paroxysmic heights in scenes of swordplay, such as this one. Irrevocably moving on from kabuki theater rules and incorporating French and Soviet ideas in film theory, the Kuro from Sentaro Shirai, made in 1927, pretty much brings the genre to its current form. High stakes, brutal, kinetic filmmaking that pitches lone warriors against oppressive systems. There is an apocalyptic dimension to the astounding fight scenes in this film. The mobile camera, the sophisticated action, the stunts, the possessed performance of a young Utema Nishikawa forging his own legend. Everything is already so modern by today's standards. The final duel still ranks among the most intense fights to ever grace the screen. Iconic, gripping, and emotionally raw. The same year, Daisuke Ito gets playful with the genre in A Diary of Chuji's Travels. Instead of the visual stimulation of Chokon, here, the director stretches his hero's ability to take on a multitude of lesser adversaries by having him warn them not to fight repeatedly, shifting the focus from actual kinetics to the anticipation of the fight. This trope, which endures to this day, is canonized in Kurama Tengu from director Teipei Yamaguchi in 1928. The film adds visual storytelling to the anticipation of the duel, to mark the sameness and opposition of the adversaries. Noticeable choices are the reduced camera movement and the beautiful mastery of the pauses and accelerations. With Sakamoto Ryoma, released the same year, Yoshiro Edamasa increases the focus on the waiting, on the observing of the opponent, which will be brought to its extreme by Akira Kurosawa a few years later. Here, the trope is still wholly integrated to a choreography of attacks and retreats. Masahiro Makino, who has a long and influential career, is responsible for several of the most striking entries in the early Chanbara canon. He probably shares with Daisuke Ito the rank of most important silent Chanbara filmmaker. The technical achievements of Ronin Guy, released in 1928, are staggering, close to offering a mobile, one-take fight scene. Cutting accelerates while maintaining perfect legibility, and more information is conveyed in less and less time with absolute clarity. Ronin Guy was released in 3 parts over 2 years, but unfortunately, most of the film is now lost. This is an extract from the end of the first part. The film has since been remade many times over the decades.
乱闘の渦中に滅ゴンベイ飛び込んだ後よりはせつける土井孫左衛門今は旗本についている赤牛や五右衛門どう様子
Legendary director Hiroshi Inagaki, who will eventually make such classics as the Musashi Miyamoto Samurai Trilogy or the mythological epic Nippon Tenjo, already makes a big splash in 1928 with The Wandering Gambler, and its dazzling, dizzying climax, pivoting images, off-screen action, whip pans, massive brawl, an impressively modern approach to filming action. The surviving fragments of Sozenji Baba from 1928 show what is perhaps the oldest extended action scene involving a woman in Japanese cinema. The heroine must fight off several attackers for close to 10 minutes of footage. Masahiro Makino, director of Ronin Guy, uses a wide range of techniques to keep the action going. The use of the environment, the change of weapons, handheld cameras. Earlier in the film, he filmed a duel with aggressive whip pans, as if the camera were trying to keep up with the fighters, which is a more naturalistic, almost documentary-like expression of cinematic action. Still in 1928, Shozo Makino directed one of the earliest adaptations of the tale of the 47 Ronin. The movie, entitled Chukon Geretsu, Jitsoroku Shushingura, contains a final battle that remains very impressive. Dynamic whip bands, quick editing, playful use of shadows, an epic setting, and even people falling off snow bridges. Once this one gets going, it never really lets up. Daisuke Ito returns in 1929 with what is perhaps his most perfectly balanced approach to the genre in Man-Slashing Horse-Piercing Sword, a return to a more immediately gratifying mise-en-scène, albeit less showy and experimental than in Chokon, but more engaging than in A Diary of Chuji's Travels. The film tells the tale of a mysterious stranger who arrives in a medieval town and eventually stops a corrupt official from seizing a legitimate power. The choreography has a sense of urgency, elaborate enough to look pleasing, but not overly sophisticated. Camera pans and extensive use of natural surroundings stand out as features that will be reused extensively in later jidaigeki, notably in the 1950s and 60s. Another incredible piece of cinema that was nearly completely lost, the surviving fragments from Rokuban Tegara, directed by Kumaiko Nishina in 1930, show signs of it being the most comprehensive early jidaigeki still in existence in terms of the exploitation of action movie tropes. The film contains a bridge explosion, sword fights, a horse chase, sword fights on moving horses, which would indicate that the team horse-mounted cameras to film the scene. And finally, one of the earliest gun-wielding women of Japanese cinema. A truly varied array of action setups, the likes of which some 21st century films are still lacking. Daisuke Ito keeps pushing the envelope in Jiro Kishido Rat in 1931. He notably continues to explore a style of filming akin to cinema verite, where the cinematographer has to keep up with the fighters. He also uses very rapid cutting with inserts that are barely 1 or 2 seconds long. With In Search of Mother, Hiroshi Inagaki takes the focus of the anticipation of the fight to the same extremes that Akira Kurosawa will adopt 2 decades later. A significant amount of time is devoted to the opponents gouging each other, while the fight itself, if we can call it that, lasts only a second or 2. Here, Inagaki also employs a dramatic, almost apocalyptic atmosphere with excessive wind, something that is still common nowadays in many film industries to give an epic dimension to the encounter. What genre doesn't have its meta and satirical comedies? Kokushi Muzo, directed by Mansaku Itami in 1932, parodies the genre by poking fun at its tropes. Exit dexterity, threatening looks, and high-stake fights. Enter imbalance and slapstick comedy. 7 years later, the famous comedian Enomoto Kenishi, known under the stage name of Enoken, starred in a parody named Enoken's Kurama Tengu. The film gave an opportunity to the audience to laugh at its own myths through a brilliant example of physical action comedy that combines slapstick with creative choreographies. Mitokomon, directed by Arai Ryohei, was a 3-part event film released in 1934 and 1935. Designed as a crowd pleaser, it reunites all of the most effective tropes of the genre, slightly undercranked action, moving cameras and so on, and adds some innovative details. For example, a framing through torn shoji paper. The results proved pulse-pounding and immensely popular. In Kensei Araki Matemon, director Kumaiko Nishina took dynamism and kineticism to new heights, combining a wide range of camera techniques that include whip pans and handheld camera. Once again, the camera operator must follow and catch the action on the fly in a way that reminds us of documentary filmmaking. This gives a sense of realism and urgency to the fight. The second half of the 1930s is marked by more overtly experimental works. Those evolve alongside masterful mainstream productions. One such experimental jidaigeki is Akanishi Kakita, directed by Mansaku Itami in 1936. It ends on an absolutely stunning variation of the duel trope, set around a piece of art that becomes part of the action. In addition, the God's View shot is added to the visual lexicon of the genre to magnificent results. Another experimental director was Sadao Yamanaka, who was part of the Narutakigumi movement of young filmmakers eager to modernize Japanese cinema. He was not interested in nihilistic heroes and world saviors. His 1936 film, Koshiyama Shoshun, one of his 3 surviving films, and probably the least well known, includes a tense chase that does away with choreography, bringing the genre closer than ever to palpable naturalism. Let's switch back to mainstream crowd pleasers. In 1937, Masahiro Makino released 2 films. One he directed on his own, and another with the equally talented Hiroshi Inagaki. The former is a now rare version of Jiraiya, a remake of the 1921 film that opened our selection. Makino's version stands as a gripping tale of revenge, with incredible visuals, a badass swordswoman, and impressive special effects that anchor the film as an important proto-tokusatsu. The second of the 2 films is called Blood Spilled at Takeda no Baba, in which the action comedy makes fairly unusual use of Soviet-inspired montage. The film also delivers a truly mesmerizing, dance-like final fight. Hiroshi Inagaki continued the next year, 1938, with the fragmentary historical war film Shusei Taikoki, attaining a visual majesty rarely encountered. Akira Kurosawa will later make it his own. The play with shadows, with nature, the tracking shots, the handheld camera, and the crowd movements, all combine to create a stunning end result. Masahiro Makino more or less closes out the decade of the 1930s for the Chanbaras genre with a prestige pre-World War II Nikatsu production entitled Chushingura, Ten no Maki in 1938. Defined by popular subject, an all-star cast, and breathtaking images. The snow-covered sets look phenomenal, with nothing coming close until Kurosawa's own Senshiro Sugata 2 some 7 years later. To this day, Makino's film remains one of the most highly regarded adaptations of the tale of the 47 Ronin. Some great Jidaigeki from the 2 decades covered here did not focus on action and were thus omitted from our overview. However, they are no less interesting in their own right. Those include The Million Ryo Pot, Humanity in Paper Balloons, Singing Lovebirds, and Story of the Last Chrysanthemums. The early decade of the Chanbara was marked by radical formal evolutions, starting as a byproduct of kabuki theater to finally end up, relatively quickly, as an avant-garde cinematic genre. The incredible freedom of movement Japanese filmmakers demonstrated still informs what is possible and enjoyable in today's film industry. This freedom was made possible by the fact that in Japan, sound films became the norm later than in the Western world. This allowed greater freedom on set in terms of logistics. Perhaps surprisingly enough, the most important films of Daisuke Ito, Masahiro Makino, and Hiroshi Nageki often did not conform to what censors thought the Chanbara was in the following decades. Centered on lone heroes standing against oppressive systems or injustice, they were not always as patriotic as one might have imagined. The genre will become more discreet in the 1940s, before disappearing almost completely for a few years after World War II. It wouldn't be very long, however, before the rebirth of the genre through the samurai classics most cinephiles are familiar with. It's been 100 years since Jiraiya the Hero was released in 1921, and if the present is any indication, the Chanbara shows no signs of slowing down.